May 7, 1915. The luxurious liner Lusitania is fading into the icy waters off the coast of Ireland. More than 1,000 souls await rescue, with land nearly within reach. Yet, just 18 minutes after the strike, it will all be over. What happened on that fateful day, and why does this disaster remain shrouded in mystery? She was the pride of Britain and the quintessence of its naval might. The Cunard liner Lusitania, a giant nearly 240 meters long, capable of carrying over 2,000 passengers. Her heart was 4 powerful Parsons steam turbines, the company's first vessel equipped with such an innovation. They produced 76,000 horsepower and drove the ship across the Atlantic at a speed of 25 knots. In October 1907, the Lusitania wrested the prestigious blue riband from German competitors, setting a transatlantic record of 4 days, 20 hours, and 0 minutes. And in November 1907, on the eastbound journey, 4 days, 19 hours, and 53 minutes. But behind this triumph lay one little-known, yet crucial detail. Still on the slipways in 1903, the British Admiralty provided Cunard with an enormous loan of £2.5 million and an annual subsidy. For this money, the ship was built in Britain, crewed by British sailors, and its design from the outset included the possibility of rapid conversion into an auxiliary cruiser. The hull incorporated reinforced decks and special platforms for mounting 12 6-inch guns. However, it is important to understand, these guns were never actually installed on board. On her final voyage in May 1915, the Lusitania sailed as a regular, albeit luxurious, unarmed passenger liner. This fact would become central to the subsequent disputes and myths surrounding her sinking. The year is 1915. The First World War has been raging for over 6 months. The German surface fleet is bottled up by the British blockade, and in response, Germany is betting on a new weapon, the submarine. On February 4th, the Kaiser's government declares the waters around the British Isles a war zone. This means any Allied vessel found in these waters may be attacked and sunk without warning. It was an unprecedented tactic, erasing the line between military and civilian shipping. And so comes the 1st of May, the day of the Lusitania's departure from New York. Many heading to Pier 54 likely opened their morning papers, and there, next to the bright advertisement for the Cunard Steamship Company, they might have seen an ominous notice. The German embassy in Washington had placed a warning. The notice was submitted to about 50 newspapers, but due to delays and approvals, on May 1, 1915, the day of sailing, it had only been printed in a few, around 10-12 papers. It stated clearly that travelers sailing into the war zone on ships of Great Britain or her allies did so at their own risk. It was a direct challenge and a grim send-off. Passengers faced a choice: cancel their trip or trust in the giant liner's invincibility and its speed. Many took their step aboard despite the anxiety, a step into the war zone. On May 1st, 1915, at noon, the giant liner Lusitania departed from Pier 54 in New York. Her course was set for Liverpool. On the bridge stood veteran Captain William Turner, recalled from the Royal Naval Reserve. On his shoulders rested the responsibility for the lives of nearly 2,000 people. 264 passengers, 693 crew members, and 3 stowaways. Among those who came aboard were individuals whose names were known across America: millionaire and Empire heir Alfred Vanderbilt, Broadway producer Charles Frohman, and popular writer Elbert Hubbard. They were embarking on a 7-day journey across the Atlantic, a journey that would be the last for many. Captain Turner had received clear instructions from the British Admiralty on how to avoid encounters with submarines. He was ordered to steer a zigzag course in dangerous waters, keep to the middle of the channel, avoid approaching headlands, and pass river mouths at full speed. These rules were printed on a memorandum dated April 16th. But on the morning of May 7th, as he approached the southern coast of Ireland, Turner made a series of decisions that would later become the subject of heated debate. He reduced speed to approximately 18 knots to fix his exact position and steered the ship on a straight course, coming quite close to the old head of Kinsale in search of a reliable landmark. This was a departure from his orders, and it would soon prove fatal. However, the crew of the Lusitania was unaware of this. Captain Turner, though he had received warnings of possible submarine activity, decided to reduce speed and take an accurate bearing off the old head of Kinsale. At 20:30 British time, his massive liner was spotted through the periscope of submarine U-20, commanded by Captain Lieutenant Walter Schweiger. The boat had been patrolling these waters for several days and had nearly exhausted its torpedoes. But for a target like the Lusitania, one remained. At 14:10 British time, from a distance of about 700 meters, U-20 fired its single shot. The steel torpedo struck the liner's starboard side just behind the bridge. The impact was severe, but a ship of that size seemed capable of surviving it. Yet almost instantly, a second, far more powerful explosion followed, tearing the hull apart from within. This became the central mystery of the disaster. What was it? A boiler explosion? A detonation of coal dust in the half-empty bunkers? Or something else? A definitive answer remains elusive to this day. The ship shuddered from this double blow. Steam pressure failed, and steering control was lost. The Lusitania began to list rapidly to starboard. This list, reaching 25 degrees within minutes, made launching the lifeboats virtually impossible. The portside boats were crushed against the hull, while those on the starboard side swung out so far that boarding them became lethally dangerous. Of the 48 lifeboats, only about 6 were successfully launched. The crew and passengers had no time. Just 18 minutes after the fateful strike, at 14:28 British time, the Lusitania, heeling over to starboard, sank bow first beneath the waves. The surface was left with debris, overcrowded lifeboats, and hundreds of people fighting for their lives in the cold water. The old head of Kinsale was just 11 miles away, visible from the deck, but rescue did not come in time. But what happened in the very seconds after the torpedo struck? Why did the mighty liner, designed to withstand damage, sink in just 18 minutes? The answer lies in the mysterious and more powerful second explosion that tore open the Lusitania's hull. And this enigma still fuels debate to this day. The facts are these. According to the ship's manifest, the cargo holds contained about 2 million rounds of rifle ammunition, Remington, 303, 5,000 empty, unfilled shrapnel shell casings, and several thousand brass fuses. These were legal military supplies with a total weight of about 173 tons. The official British Inquiry of 1915 asserted these materials were stored far from the torpedo's point of impact and could not have detonated. But here is the controversy. Modern expeditions studying the wreck in 2006 and 2008 discovered thousands of 303 caliber cartridges in the bow section. Furthermore, in 1982, a previously classified memorandum from the British Foreign Office was made public, acknowledging a large quantity of ammunition in the wreck, while no direct evidence of undeclared high explosives has ever been found. These discoveries force a re-examination of the old claims. This is why there is still no consensus on the cause of the second explosion. 3 main theories exist. The first is the official British version of the time, a boiler or high-pressure steam explosion. The second, proposed by researcher Robert Ballard, suggests a coal dust explosion in an emptied bunker. And the third, insisted upon by Germany, is the detonation of part of the military cargo. Each theory has its proponents, but none is conclusively proven. This mystery, resting at a depth of 90 meters, remains unsolved. The investigation into the loss of the Lusitania was entrusted to Lord Mersey, the very same man who had previously examined the circumstances of the Titanic disaster. It began in June of 1915. In its final verdict, the Inquiry Commission placed all blame on those who planned and carried out the crime, Germany. Captain William Turner, despite having deviated from some Admiralty instructions, was fully exonerated. This, however, did not save him from public vilification, but he endured and later returned to sea. Here arises one of the most contentious theories, which has stirred debate for decades. It suggests that the British leadership, specifically Winston Churchill, deliberately exposed the Lusitania to provoke the United States into entering the war. However, most serious historians reject this version as unproven and unsupported by documentary evidence. It remains a fringe theory, not an established fact. And this leads us to an important clarification. While the sinking of the Lusitania and the deaths of 128 of the 139 Americans aboard did indeed cause a wave of outrage in the United States and sharply shifted public opinion, it was not the direct trigger for America's entry into the First World War. The United States declared war on Germany on April 6, 1917, nearly 2 years later, primarily due to the resumption of unrestricted submarine warfare and the intercepted Zimmermann telegram. In 1918, an American court ruled the sinking an illegal act, and in 1925, the Mixed Claims Commission awarded the United States compensation from Germany. The settlement for the Lusitania amounted to about $2.5 million plus interest, but actual payments were delayed by the Great Depression and the rise of the Nazis. The final debts from these claims were settled by West Germany in the latter half of the 20th century, formally closing the chapter on this tragedy. So what remains of that fateful day? Numbers, names, and questions that still trouble researchers. On the shore, in quiet church ledgers and on memorial plaques, the names of 94 of the 129 children and infants who were on board are forever preserved. The youngest passengers of the Lusitania, many of those who found themselves on the upper deck in the final minutes, saw the old head of Kinsale on the horizon. The shore, a symbol of salvation that was so close, just 11 miles away, and yet impassably far, help simply did not arrive in time. And down there, in the cold waters of the Celtic Sea, at a depth of about 90 meters, lie the wreckage. It rests on its starboard side, and over more than a century, ocean currents and corrosion have done their work. But even today, these steel remains hold the Lusitania's central mystery, the secret of the second, devastating explosion. Was it a boiler explosion, coal dust, or something else? Each new expedition uncovers new details, thousands of rifle cartridges, hull fragments, but has never produced the smoking gun, the definitive proof. It is this unresolved nature, this crack in the official history, that prevents the story of the Lusitania from becoming just a page in a textbook. It continues to live, stirring minds and reminding us that even the most famous disaster can have its shadows.